Good morning. We're so glad you're here. We want to welcome you to this week's Grow, where we gather to recharge, organize, and work here as members of MWEG, Mormon Women for Ethical Government. We are delighted that we have Julie Mirlicourtois with us, who is a producer and director of the Across documentary series. We have an event coming up for MWEG members on July 31st and August 2nd to have a discussion about this documentary series. And we invite all of you to be part of that discussion. But today we're going to talk about the documentary itself, and we'll watch a part of the trailer for that, and talk to Julie about her experience with it and what they wanted, what they're trying to get across with this information, no pun intended. So I'm going to turn the time over to Miranda Cutler to introduce Julie, and then we'll get started.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rachel. And we're so glad to have you here, like Rachel said, and so privileged to have Julie join us. Stacy and I met Julie last fall, or last November. We were at the Leading the Way conference with the National Immigration Forum in Houston, and they did a showing of her documentary Across, and so we got to meet Julie there. And during that time, it was watching the film was really moving. We loved being in the room with all the women, and there was not a dry eye there in the room as we watched it, and it was such a privilege to meet her. So we're excited to be offering the opportunity to watch this film, and excited to introduce Julie to you. Julie is the co-creator and executive producer of the film, and for 15 years, she produced award-winning human interest stories viewed by millions for CBS News, The Oprah Winfrey Show, Oprah's Next Chapter, and Oprah's Where Are They Now? And today she is the co-creator and executive producer of the popular Maybe God podcast. In addition to that impressive resume, she's also an amazing mom, and we had some fun conversations about what it's like to navigate school systems and neighborhoods as a mom. There was one other thing I wanted to say. Oh, okay. So as Rachel mentioned, we are offering this to you, and we'll put a link in the chat of how to register for the discussion events. And when you register for the discussion event, even if you can't make one of those, just sign up. And then we will send you, after you register, a link to or instructions with a username and a password to log in and watch all 4 episodes of the documentary. And on the 31st in the evening or the 2nd in the morning, you can join us for one of those discussions, and would love to have you join us for that. So Julie, we can't see you on the screen, so if you could turn on your camera. Yeah, there you go.
Hi.
Okay, great. So welcome.
Thank you.
We're so glad that you could join us. And you're in Houston, right, Julie?
I am, yes.
Is it? Okay.
I'm in Spring Branch.
Okay, awesome. Where is that? Is that north, south?
So it's
Stacy knows, I'm sure.
west. It's
Okay.
on the way to the suburbs, still in Houston, but on, as close to Houston as you can be before you hit the suburbs.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. And Stacy, you're in the northeast, is that right?
Yeah, northeast.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's technically Houston, but it's right by
Yeah, great. So we thought, just to start off, so we know what we're talking about, Julie, could you just give us a brief synopsis of what the film is about, and then we'll watch the trailer.
Absolutely. So Across follows the lives of 3 asylum-seeking families. We followed them for about 2.5 years. They all came to the U.S. for different reasons and faced different challenges, from parent-child separation to detention centers to all sorts of issues. And what's unique, though, about this documentary series is that it also follows the Americans who walk alongside them, Christian Americans who walk alongside them. And so, unlike a lot of immigration films, by featuring these Christians, we're witnessing the mutual transformation that happens as Americans walk alongside these asylum seekers, and what those relationships look like. So the stories are told through the eyes of the asylum seekers, but also through the people who have, become their family here in the U.S.
Yeah. I love that. And I think it's really a unique perspective. And the episode that Stacy and I watched was the second episode, which shows this Midwestern church of mostly older people taking the plunge. And I love how it shows their trepidation and like, are we sure we want to do this? And it really resonated with me and what I've seen in my own congregation. So, okay, let's watch the trailer. Rachel, if you can get that going, or I can, yeah, you got it.
An extraordinary number of migrants crossed the U.S.-Mexico border over the weekend.
Nearly 1,000 people crossed the Rio Grande on Sunday night alone, stretching an already taxed border.
And in Arizona, footage showing hundreds of migrants illegally crossing.
Why don't they just follow the law? Could they even be Christians if they've broken the law?
La verdad que no tenemos trabajo en el país, seguridad, salud.
Estaban extorsionando y si usted no entrega ese dinero, ellos matan a la gente.
I think perceptions of people in the area is only what they see on the television.
There are high rates of femicide in Central America.
It really is tantamount to modern-day slavery. The people that are seeking asylum and other forms of legal protection, they're the victims.
Yo viví una vida de mucho sufrimiento y mis hijos también. Los iba a matar a nosotros porque él siempre me decía que yo no valía nada.
The journey north is horrifically treacherous.
Rezaba mucho por mi hija, porque era muy pequeña, tenía 10 años.
Hay unos maderos allí del río, si los agarran, nuestra familia tiene que pagar mucho dinero y si no los matan.
Digo que de nuestra comunidad, siempre digo, la gente mejor es la que se ha ido en nuestras comunidades.
Pedí a Dios que me diera esa oportunidad, entregar mi hijo a la migración para salvar la vida de mi hijo.
Every time they do a check-in, they're meeting with a deportation officer, which is really scary because they're always on that edge.
Y me decía mi mamá, hija, pero ¿y cuándo te van a entregar a tu niño? Mamá, no sé cuándo.
We see the news and we forget that it's moms and daughters, you know, the human side of it.
I felt I was a committed Christian, but the walk changes because the experiences you have with people from another culture.
We have received families who have lost absolutely everything, who have been mistreated and attacked, and they're still praising God. That is faith.
I'm so glad we got to watch that. It's so powerful to see all those different voices and to see, you know, probably a little bit of what got you interested. So this film was released last year, and I know you've been creating other types of films for about 15 years, Julie, but this is your first documentary. So what led you to create this film and on this important topic?
Yeah, I'll back up a little bit with a little of my backstory. So as you all mentioned in the introduction, I did work in secular media for a long time, and I was not a Christian. So I always had a heart for sharing human interest stories, and that was always my specialty wherever I worked. But about 8 years ago, almost 9 now, I moved to Houston, Texas for my family and my husband's job. And I decided to leave the secular media world. And it was at that point that I became a Christian here in Houston through a church called the Story Church. And when I came to faith, that just changed everything I wanted to do about my work. And so I created about 6 years ago, it's called the Maybe God podcast. It's with the pastor of our church as the host. And it's called Maybe God because we're trying to get people outside of the Christian world to consider that maybe God plays a role in a lot of these things. And we tackle a lot of issues that keep people out of the church, especially in this like divided, very polarized culture that we live in right now. There are a lot of things that are unfortunately keeping people away from church and from faith. and from Christianity in general. So we tackle a lot of those issues. And in 2018, 2019 is when we tackled immigration. And I was introduced to the pastor who's featured in this film, Pastor John Garland, who's in San Antonio, through a former colleague of mine who was working at CNN at the time, not a Christian, but she called me and she said, I heard you're a Christian now, and I met this incredible pastor, and he's in San Antonio working with immigrants, that you need to meet him. And so gave him a call, and I think it was 12 hours after I got off the phone with him, I was in San Antonio. I was like, we have to share these stories. These are incredible stories. So drove out to San Antonio with my little recording device and my sound team. And that day really is just burned in my memory, because I remember so Pastor John Garland is the lead pastor of the San Antonio Mennonite Church. And they have a hospitality house that they've had for decades that used to be for just traveling Mennonites. But San Antonio, starting in 2016, really it just exploded with this immigration crisis, because when people cross the border in Texas, they automatically go through San Antonio. That's just a hub for all buses and trains and airplanes and all of that. And so suddenly this tiny little Mennonite church had hundreds of people just being dropped at their doorstep, and they were trying to care for them the best they could. And this hospitality house had turned into a place where the mothers and children who had nowhere to go, maybe they had sponsors, but they had met sponsors through Facebook, and it turns out they were human traffickers. Maybe they, weren't able to reach relatives. And so they would stay and seek refuge in this little hospitality house. And so I was dropped into that hospitality house, not really understanding the immigration crisis or anything about it, not knowing that it was going to be the next several years of my life studying it. And I was sitting at the table. I don't speak Spanish, but I was surrounded by these incredible women, and one of them who's featured in the documentary, her name is Santos. And at the time that I met Santos, she was separated from her son. And she had just been reunited with her daughter, who had been in a child detention center. And she was fasting and praying and just, pleading with God to be reunited with her child. Pastor John was the first to admit that he had very little hope that she would actually be reunited with him. They had no idea where he was. But she had this just incredible faith and this certainty that, God was walking alongside them. He had been with them this whole time, and he was going to reunite her with her son. And so I was just so inspired and learned so much that day. I think being at that point a relatively new Christian, I had these two sides of me. I had the sort of one side that was steeped in the secular world that just thought, how come when we hear stories of immigrants, we never hear about this deep faith? It's just often ignored. And I think often the secular audience likes to we have to come in and be their saviors and to save them, right? But I realized, gosh, they have a savior. They don't see it that way necessarily. And then on the other side of it, I was thinking about my, brothers and sisters in Christ back in Houston. And I was thinking, how come they don't know that how come they don't talk about this population? How come they don't realize these are their brothers and sisters in Christ? How come they're not, being the hands and feet of Christ and welcoming them into their churches the way Pastor John is? And so we did the podcast episode, and the reaction was really just, it was incredied. So many people just responded about how it just completely opened their eyes to the situation in a different way. And that's what made me feel really called to go back to my video roots and do video. And so it was supposed to be a 90-minute documentary, and it turned into a 4-part documentary series, because there's just so many layers of the onion to peel back. As I started following these families, it was complicated. There were so many things that I thought we needed to all understand. And so it just turned into a much larger project than I ever anticipated.
Thank you. I love hearing all those details and how you came to this in such a faith-filled way, really. And I think that question that you bring up, I think, is something that we in our congregations also have felt like, why, if the Bible says that we're supposed to welcome the stranger, why are we not talking about it? Why are we not doing more in this regard? And I know that a lot of us do, and a lot of our friends do, but we encounter opposition, I think, because politics and immigration politics has clouded our Christian view, I think. Tell me about what obstacles have you faced as you created the documentary and as you've been trying to promote it and get it out there so people can see it, and how have you responded to those? And also tell us about the reception. I'm sure you've received positive reception as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a challenge, and I think it's grown me in my faith incredibly. I mean, just in trusting God and what His plan is in this, because it's been a roller coaster for sure since the beginning. When we first started the project, Pastor John, even though he agreed to let us into their lives, he was fiercely protective of these asylum seekers, rightfully so. And he didn't necessarily have trust for us yet, but the field producer that I hired ended up moving in a trailer park with all these other asylum seekers and taking them to doctor's appointments and becoming a part of their family. And we just really took our time and started to gain everybody's trust. But I remember early on, there were times we would plan on filming something, and I joke with Pastor John about this. He would tell us he was going to walk one way, from the school, walking the kids home from school to the church, but then ended up taking another way just to avoid us. And so we were just missing constantly all of these moments. And I was like, oh, this is so. And then also the asylum seekers, their lives are just so challenging. They move around a lot. They are obviously recovering from a lot of trauma. So obviously we want to be really, really sensitive. But on the other side of that, it's just very challenging to. I had no idea when we started filming them when their stories go on forever, what we were going to be able to capture, and when we would where would we land these stories. And so just the storytelling was really challenging. We did gain everybody's trust, and it did work out beautifully, I think, but it was in the process, it was really challenging. And as far as the reception, I mean, I think the biggest surprise to me is how much we've become a tool for organizations who are working already in immigration, and specifically Christian organizations. They've felt like it's really hard to get churches to pay attention and to care about these issues. And so they've found that a cross is a tool for them to show, like, look, here are the stories, here's what happens when Christians walk alongside these asylum seekers. And that's been a really beautiful surprise to me. At the end of the day, if we don't get, on Netflix, that's okay. If we're a resource for all these other organizations, that's been fantastic to see. Churches, we've had churches watching across the country of all different denominations, which I think is so cool and really reassuring to me that everybody, wants to be biblical as far as this issue is concerned, and dig in. And what we're trying to do is not, we've kept the politics out of this, and we're just trying to allow churches and Christians to have healthier conversations about this issue through the stories. Versus through the politics. And so we've had churches where they have had to really wrestle through some of this, since their politics might not align with, sort of welcoming the stranger. And so it's been really neat to see people being willing to wrestle. Some of the challenges have been for more national distribution, or more traditional distribution is what I should say. Angel Studios was very interested in the film, but ultimately their guild, their voting members, they tend to be fairly conservative, and they didn't want to be challenged in this way. And so that was, a little disappointing. But on the other hand, like I said, we've got screenings happening all over the country with different groups, and it tends to actually be women, which is what I've learned. This really is a film for women, I think, because they're kind of willing to look past the politics and approach it, from a biblical perspective, but also it just really lean into these difficult stories.
Thank you. That's really encouraging to hear that so many people in different places are excited and willing to challenge their perceptions. So this summer, our membership has been participating in something that we call the Hope Experiment. In a time when many are discouraged and worried, even afraid about politics and the border and many other issues, we're trying to plant those seeds of peacemaking, community connection, and trust building. And we're offering the Across documentary as part of that quest to build hope. The stories of the migrant families portrayed in Across are often tragic. And we wanted to ask, how have you found their stories and the stories of those who receive them in the U.S. hopeful, despite their tragic nature.
Yeah, I touched on this a little bit when I was talking about Santos when I first met her. I think um, their faith and their joy is just incredible, and I would say I witness it more in the asylum seekers than many of the Americans I know. It's funny, my daughter and I, for 2 years, our family's gone on a mission trip to the DR, and it was her first time being surrounded in small villages with kids who are really have nothing. And she said to me, "Mommy, why do they seem so much happier than the kids back home?" And I think that's what I experienced too, just with the asylum seekers. When you're around them, there's so much struggle, but there's so much joy and there's so much faith. And again, I think that's what's been left out of their stories when it's told in some more traditional news media type outlets. I think they focus so much on the pain and the heartache and the struggle, and they forget the joy and the love. Santos, all of the moms in the film and the love they have for their children. This is not a commentary on a pro-choice or a pro-life stance, but Santos, the hard reality that we didn't include in the documentary is that all of her children were conceived through rape. But she is a mother who did do everything she possibly could for her children, and has this deep love from her children and for her children, and the joy that brings into her life is just incredible to witness. And I think when you take a step back and see these are mothers and children, and any of us who are mothers know what we do for our children, it's just incredible to watch.
Yeah. Wow, that's a really humbling detail to think about. Thanks for sharing that. I really loved well, I feel like you mentioned that in the documentary you don't get into the politics of immigration. But I feel like in addition to because you tell the stories in great detail, kind of from beginning to end. I mean, of course, the story goes on both directions, but I feel like there's a lot of education there in immigration policy. Immigration is so complex, and in our organization, we do a lot trying to educate people about what does this status mean, and what's an asylum seeker versus a refugee, and what's really happening at the border. But when you get into the stories, and you also educate us about what some of these policies mean, and more importantly, how they play out for real people, and how they play out in good ways and bad ways and confusing ways. And I think that's really helpful as we try to understand these stories from an empathetic way. We also need to get the details, the facts. And I feel like the documentary balances that really well. One thing that I really love is that in addition to telling the story of what happens to them once they cross the border, you kind of go backwards and go to Honduras and explore what happened to I forgot, was it Santos's town that you went to?
Family.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Talk to us more about that. What's the behind the scenes story of did you plan to go there from the beginning, and what led you there, and what experiences did you have while you were there?
Well, throughout the film, I think we're really addressing some of the misconceptions that Americans, American Christians, everybody really has about these immigrants. And so as we started following Santos and she started talking about what she was facing back home that forced her to leave, I just thought we've got to show people what is really happening on the ground that's, causing these mothers and children to flee. And I think oftentimes we assume, oh, they'd rather be here. They came here because they think they can make more money and they'd rather be here. But the truth is they'd rather be back home. When you see Santos's home and meet her friends and her family, she wants nothing more than to be back there. But then you hear the stories about how many times her life and her children's lives were in jeopardy. You realize, again, back to that mother, like any mother would have made the same decision for their child. Or for their family. And so I just really wanted people to see what was really happening. We also, we wanted this film to be valuable to all of these families, and we wanted to bring the lawyers into the process with us. And we said, what kind of evidence do you need for Santos's case to show the judge that there was a real threat and that her life would be in danger if she went back there. And we actually have somebody on camera saying that if she were to come back, she would be dead within a matter of days. And that's actually that's often the case when people are sent back, which is the sad reality. And so we wanted to help with we hired her lawyer, a fantastic lawyer, and we wanted to help be part of the process in her seeking asylum. So that was part of going back to Honduras as well. And it was challenging. I actually did not go myself. I hired a field producer who was the first one who introduced me to Pastor John Garland. Actually, she's the one that we've always typically sent into war zones whenever I worked with her. She just loves that action. And she found a local crew and a fixer. But it was interesting because she hired a local crew from the city and they went to this small village. Well, the crew from Honduras was actually quite fearful a lot of the time that they were filming in this small village. And the very last day, it wasn't scheduled to be the last day, but we ended filming early. They were in somebody's house doing an interview. And you can imagine this is really risky because they're going around asking people about the gang members. What have you seen? What have they done to Santos? What are these people like? And this is a place where people are scared to talk because there's not any sort of protection from police, from the gang members. So they were in somebody's house and this person was opening up about just how threatened they've felt from the gang members. And our sound guy through his, headphones could hear in the house next door, because the houses are so tiny and all packed in together, he heard somebody say, "Go get the gun." And immediately they stopped filming. They kept the cameras rolling. We thought about using this, but I decided not to. And they left the village and drove 2 hours as far as they could go drive away and find a hotel that was, had walls all around it and where they felt safe to kind of figure out what their next steps were. But I remember it was the middle of the night when they called me and they were all so shaken, but they were mostly shaken because they realized, what kind of danger have we put Santos's sister in, who was the one escorting them around the village? Will she be okay? Like, we can leave, but she has to live there. And so for weeks, they were very fearful that they had put her life, in harm's way. So I'm glad we did it. I think it was important. It's actually my favorite episode. I just think it's so important for us to hear the voices from Honduras.
Yeah, I agree. That's I hope also that it was worth the sacrifice for everyone. But it's so poignant to see those stories. Stacy, do you want to go ahead?
Yep.
The next one.
What are some of the common misconceptions you find that Christians have about immigrants and immigration? You mentioned a little bit about the lawyer and asking, what is the evidence that they might need, and so that might be something that people don't really understand. So, what are those misconceptions, and how do you address those in your work?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones I hear is, why didn't they just follow the rules and come here legally? But there is no clear legal pathway for Central American asylum seekers. They've actually been told, hey, just put your foot on American soil and then immediately turn yourself into Border Patrol. And that's how it's a minor misdemeanor, which is the equivalent of a, traffic violation. And then you can enter the asylum system. So I think they're not trying, and once they get here, the majority of the asylum seekers that I've met, they want to do everything in their power to follow the rules and the laws, because they really want to be a part of the US in a above board way. And so I think this idea that they're, quote unquote illegals, and that they came legally, and that's the choice they made. Like, that's the only choice they felt like they had to seek safety. Also, this idea that maybe they don't want to work, they're just here to mooch off of us. And we see that through Jennifer's story. It bothered her so much that she felt like a charity case when the Mennonite church was taking care of her and her family. And you see how just distraught she is, that she's like, I want to be on the other side. I want to be working and I want to be helping people. So I think that's a misconception too. Again, this idea that that they're bad people. It's funny, I went to a border trip recently along the Texas-Mexico border, and we met with Border Patrol. And even he admitted, he's like, I forget what he was like, 80 something percent of these people are people that I'd invite to a barbecue one day. They're good people, they're families. And, I think there's just so much focus on the few that aren't. Also this idea that that this is bringing drugs into our country. We didn't address this so much in the documentary, but we had a gang expert who was kind of an expert on that region who was talking about this. But oftentimes it's Americans who are bringing the fentanyl across the border. So there's so many misconceptions. Wanting people to understand that there a large majority of the asylum seekers coming from Central America, from the Northern Triangle of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are Christians. And I'd say evangelical Christians in the true sense of the word. I think that's often overlooked. And like I said before, that there's this idea that they want to be here, that they were just coming to seek opportunity, when all of the women and their children who I met felt like they had no choice but to be here and wanted nothing more than to be back home. You see them we followed quite a few of them to the American churches. They even just the lack of and then that's one of the things we showed in Honduras was, what does Santos's church look like in Honduras? And you'd see these people dancing until 3 a.m. and jumping up and down. And then she's in this tiny little Mennonite church where everybody's like barely moving, and singing. And she just wants to be home worshiping with her pastor in her church. So yeah, those are a bunch of them. I'm sure there are more.
Oh, you touched on so many important ones. I appreciate that. And it doesn't take a lot in the right context to explain to people why those misconceptions don't make sense. Okay, let's see. We have, this isn't a question. Just thanks, Diana, for that comment. She recommends Between Everything and Nothing, The Journey of Mohammed and Rizal Iyal, which we actually did for our book club. We could share the recording of it, I think. But yeah, so many good stories out there. And we were talking earlier about how important it is, not just with immigration, but with other politicized topics. As we're talking to people, we can throw statistics and facts back and forth and get deep into the policy. But when we share stories, that's when we can find common ground. And really, I mean, as Christians, when we share those stories and connect with people, then we feel the Spirit, and the Spirit can teach us truth, right? And that's where we can come together and find peace. Thank you so much for joining us, Julie. This has been really great. I know you're super busy doing so many good things out there. Tell us just before we go, what are your plans for the future and what gives you hope?
Well, the Maybe God podcast is keeping me pretty busy, and I hope to, we're tackling a lot of issues, especially in this election year, just a lot of controversial, divisive issues, and trying to have healthier conversations by sharing stories that, again, show the nuances of these issues. And so, I love doing that work and plan on continuing to do that. And we'll see if it leads to any more documentary projects. And one thing that really has been giving me hope, my family and I are looking into this right now, and I'm sure you've all talked about it, but if you haven't, it's worth looking into. The US government has created a program called Welcome Corps, where individuals and churches can sponsor families directly. And they've opened that up to refugees in Latin America versus just, Afghanistan, Africa, that sort of thing. And so my family's looking into that. I've honestly never felt that I, could do it with a smaller home, and I had all these reasons for why it wouldn't be possible, but I've been really encouraged. And we're coming together with a small group in our church, and we're going to be looking into sponsoring a family. And so that's what I'm really excited about in this next season.
That's amazing. Yeah, we have been talking about Welcome Court, and I'll just highlight that this month, so if you can apply by the end of the month, and I've heard that if you get your applications started and actually name an organization that an MWEG member started called Welcome NST as your cooperating organization, you can access so there's a sponsor, I think it's called the Sponsor Fund. They will do your they will provide the funding for you. Normally you have
Oh,
to
wow.
fundraise. I think
Yeah.
is it 4,000 per person that you bring? I think
I had
that's
heard 3 to 4. Yeah.
3 to 4. Yeah. So if you apply before July 31st, then you have access to those funds being covered up to 4 people. So that's a huge opportunity if you can pull yourselves together. And like you, Julie, I'm trying to pull it together too. Yeah, I went to an information session with a resettlement agency here in Utah, and it really is a great opportunity to get involved with resettlement. Before this program, you had to live in a city center and work, and the resettlement agency did most of the work and you just supported, and that can be a tricky relationship. This gives you a lot more autonomy to do it where you are and welcome them into your own community instead of having to travel to the big metropolis where these resettlement agencies are. So it's super exciting. Stacy put the links in for both Welcome. So Welcome Corps is where you'll apply, but if you want the support of Welcome NST, they provide some really great tools. So you can name them as your supporting organization, and they will help you in the process as well. So thank you so much for everyone for joining us, and thank you, Julie, for your work. And don't forget to sign up for the discussion on July 31st or August 2nd. And once you sign up, you'll get the links to watch for free. So you can watch under our license. Otherwise, you have to pay $20. So I'm super excited for this opportunity, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thanks,
have a great
Julie.
day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for being on the Grow today. We have some links in the chat. We'll put those in the comments on MWEG Central and with the recording of today's Grow. And then so you can register to watch those documentaries. And we hope that everybody's doing well with their Hope experiment. There's a link in there. This is a great part of that, of building community. You can invite friends and family to watch the different episodes with you and invite them to come to the discussion as well. And we hope you guys all have a good week, and we'll be back next week with Grow. Have a good day.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.